Hi, this is Austin, and I'm one of the show's producers. As many of you know, we are in the process of looking for an executive director to join our team at the Allender Center at the Seattle School. Our search committee is currently seeking applicants, and we deeply value your imagination on our behalf. If you or someone you know might be a good fit for this role, please visit theseattleschool.edu/jobs and click on the executive director link under open positions.
Thank you for listening to the Allender Center podcast. I'm Dr. Dan Allender.
And I'm Rachel Clinton Chen. We're fiercely committed to providing hope and healing to a fragmented world.
And restoration for the heart.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
One of the things we delight doing is to bring dear friends and colleagues who have labored with us at the Allender Center for what feels like centuries into conversation. What we really want to do is to invite story to help you get a better sense of how to look at and read your own story. And so Gwen St, a long-term Allender Center leader. Gwen, so good to have you with Rachel and me today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So let's talk about your wild, lovely, odd, compelling life. And to do that, I just want you to kind of introduce yourself and tell people a little bit about how you are situated in the world, with whom, and enough to begin the conversation.
Sure. Well, I'm situated in the world. I live in Seattle with my husband, Gabriel, and our daughter, Marigold. And I am working, have been working for a number of years as a therapist here, have a private practice, and have had the honor and joy of working with the Allender Center for coming on 6 years.
Which we would count to be about 42 years. We do dog years.
Yeah, I can feel that in my body for sure.
Well, maybe just to begin, how did you get involved with a sundry group like the Allender Center?
Well, I mean, it goes back to just being a student at the Seattle School, or back when it was called Marcel Graduate School, and coming to the really crucial understanding that my story was the first way I began to make sense to myself. And the first experience I had in a group, especially with Christian teaching, where my story got to be part of what made me me and helped me just give myself a name that I really needed. So when you started the Allender Center, I was immediately intrigued and wanted to be a part of it. And so, I just remember getting to experience going through the externship and getting to know more and more about myself and other people through the realm of story, and just finding it so poignantly important.
Well, it's interesting, even as you said, like your story getting to be a primary way in which you know yourself, and linking that to like maybe something that was missing in Christianity, or at least some of the ways we're formed to think, which is so fascinating, when really what it means to be Christian is to be wrapped up in a story, in a larger story. And I experience you as just such a, you contain a multitude of stories that I think deeply shape the way in which you live and love in the world. So I'm really grateful that you're a part of our team and that you thought it would be fun to play with us.
Yeah, so I still want to kind of knock on that door to say, you're an odd woman, and you kind of have a sense of maybe being unusual. Is that a fair way of putting it? Or you can just push back and say, you're the odd one.
I was going to say she is in good company. So.
Well, we certainly know the two of us. But so is that a fair entry? Like, how is it that you're so odd?
Yeah, I mean, I know myself to be odd, and I can now enjoy myself as an odd being without feeling like that makes me unknowable. So that's something that I found to be, that's partly what I mean when I say that knowing my story has helped me make sense to myself. I think, I've always felt odd, and sort of the beginning places of my story take me back to the fact that my parents were Canadian Plymouth Brethren. And if you don't know what Plymouth Brethren means, you can know that they are a group of Christians that are deeply committed to very sacredly holding the text of Scripture, and to the point of women, for instance, wearing head coverings. And that was my childhood life, being the daughter of people who were from a different country and living in a realm that didn't make sense to most of the people that I knew. Yeah.
And how did you fit? I know it's a huge question. How did you fit in that world?
I had to make myself fit in that world, although that wasn't too difficult for me because I was a really sensitive and quiet child. I don't know if I would have been sensitive and quiet were it not for some of the circumstances of trauma in my childhood. But I do know that that I bowed fairly easily to the idea that women and girls should be quiet for at least the first 10 years of my life, until that became really unendurable for me. So, yeah, I don't know if I'm answering that question well.
Well, I think it's an almost impossible question to grapple with well. And that is, when you live within a world that in some ways requires women to be silent, furthering with the unusual, but again, not that unusual head covering. And then to create a context where, again, without spending any more time than you would wish, naming that there was trauma in your own childhood. Those are so many factors for why having a voice would have consequences. But I love the fact that you've also named that you were a reader of people, that you're very sensitive, which is what I mean by you're a reader of people. You watch people, you feel the presence of people. So in one larger sense, how did you become a reader of the world and people?
Yeah, I love that question. And that is how I understand myself from a very young age. I think that I was born with a really highly sensitive system and was never going to be anything but that. And in addition to that, I think I was born into a world where watching and reading was acceptable and required. So the sense of I was supposed to be quiet, and I sat through a lot of listening to people and to stay interested, watch their face. But then I also think about how important it was within my family system to read faces really well in order to stay safe.
And how did that work? What did it look like for you to read your world, your family around you?
Well, I mean, an important thing to say is that in my family world, being a person, being a family of faith was deeply important. That was how we were identified in the world, and being people who had it well, had it good, and was important so that we could live our lives in order to bring other people into what was good in the faith in Jesus. And so there was a lot that was hidden in my family that was not well, that was not going well. Specifically, my oldest brother, I'm the youngest of four, my oldest brother began to abuse substances around the age of 12 when I was just about 4 or 5 years old. And in that, because my parents were very busy doing ministry often, I was often left with my older siblings. And so around the same time that he began abusing substances, he also began abusing me. And so I think I just had to live in a lot of secrecy, hiddenness, and needed to read well what was going to happen in my family in order to try to stay as safe as I possibly could.
Again, I'm privileged to know your story, but it's just agonizing to even hear the words that you've spoken, and to know that in the context of abuse, secrecy, the demand for silence, that is a setup to live, in some ways, a constant sense of a contradiction. The family, the world is moving one direction with one statement of how we believe and how we function, while subterranean, there's a whole other chock full of heartache, but also contradiction. So again, just to step back and say, how have you lived in the midst of that kind of two worlds, three worlds, multiple worlds, but particularly contradictory worlds?
I think what comes to my mind when I ask you, say how, is like, I imagine being back in my childhood through this present time, and how pivotally, I can't even say that word, pivotally important story was in terms of reading. So one thing that was always accessible to me was books. And I just devoured the stories of other people to try to help me understand those contradictions that I was holding within my own body, which was really the most safe place for the contradiction to land, was in my body, because that didn't hurt anyone else. Wasn't well with my body, but I would read stories that would make sense and that could help me understand myself on some level. And yeah.
Like, anyone come to mind at the moment? Any one author, story that your heart often went back to?
Yes, the orphan characters of L.M. Montgomery, who wrote the storybooks about Anne of Green Gables, for instance. She also wrote a series about a girl named Emily, who I would say was probably a very highly sensitive person and saw the world with just so much acuity, and always was thinking and observing about all of her family members.
Yeah, Gwen, when you mention the books by L.M. Montgomery, I think most people are so familiar with Anne of Green Gables and all of the stories about Anne, and I think very few people, or not as many people, have had access to or been exposed to the stories of Emily. And I'm curious for you, as you named, that you're drawn to these stories of orphan, and not just an orphan, but a highly sensitive orphan. And I'm curious, for you and a full family, how that theme of orphan came to be something that you were learning to make sense of about yourself through someone else's story.
Yeah, I mean, now looking back, I can offer myself some perspective on why I had such a sense of feeling like an orphan when I clearly looked like my older siblings and wasn't adopted. But there was something in me that was like, was I adopted? I do not feel like I make sense. My body is constantly brimming over with emotion and senses that no one else is talking about. Where did I come from? How did I become this way? I think a lot of that is just that I was born with this trait of high sensitivity. And then I think also some of the orphan feeling was just, I was born to a mother who was deeply depleted by the time I came along. It wasn't a planned pregnancy. Her doctor was actually very frustrated because she was so low with severe anemia when she gave birth to me that she wasn't super available to me in my infancy. And there was a lot of other people who were, so I was passed around a lot. And I'm sure that somewhere in my psyche, and my body's understanding, I felt like I didn't quite have that secure attachment that I needed. Yeah.
And I would love for you to think about how the abuse that you put words to created as well a sense of not fitting.
Mm-hmm. I think that potentially the most deep damage of the abuse, not that it all needs to be qualified, but like that it made me feel more cut off from my mother in particular. I think the implicit or explicit, I don't fully know, but the threat was, if mom ever finds out, she will die. And so it was kind of a choice of either ask my mom for the help that I need, but then she might die. So there was just, the abuse cut me off from my mother, and I really needed a mother, as does everyone. But it was that sense between she and I of the abuse particularly disconnecting us that made me feel really orphaned.
Well, orphaned because of a lack of attachment, but prospectively orphaned in that if you have the power through your words in asking for help, you might take her life. And so to be not just orphaned, but is it too strong to say in that sense? If you have a voice, you're a murderer.
Which again is always complex for little bodies, right? Because as adults, we can go, well, that's not true. And I think, a lot of times that's our inclination, even to ourselves, when we feel something that, we might be able to critically think our way through. But in a little body that's highly sensitive, those truths are more true. Those threats and those fears, whether they're being, explicitly named, or I would say explicitly read, whether they're being vocalized or not, they're there. And just because something is being intuited doesn't mean it's not explicit. Oftentimes, I think the undercurrents that aren't being named but are being said are way more explicit than and I think that's what you've named in this contradiction of there's a presentation, but there's a lot going on that contradicts that. And so, of course, in a little body, that threat of I will kill my mom, like I'll have the power to destroy her by simply asking for help about something that I actually don't have power over. And I think that can be really confusing and really defining for us in our stories and the trajectory of our stories. Because it keeps you from, I would imagine that kept you from connection to your mom over a longer season than just when that threat maybe felt most keenly.
Gwen, what would you say has been the benefit or the implication of doing this story work?
Well, like I was saying earlier, that reality that doing story work has helped me make sense to myself. And in many ways, I would say I've experienced a level of being mothered through story work, if that makes sense, like a sense of someone, my own story, handled well with care and attunement through therapy, through doing story work through the Allender Center has been so remarkably renaming to me of you make sense. Your body's reactions to things are meaningful and not crazy. That's been huge for me. And I think about even when I first came to begin naming particularly the story of abuse in my life, I remember sitting in a group with you, Dan, when I was in school and in a practicum group and beginning to talk about my oldest brother, and you pausing the group and saying to everyone, like, do you feel that feeling in your body? You are in the presence of a story of abuse. I didn't even have the language of abuse at that point, but I remember so keenly how you tied my story to how everyone in the room was feeling in their body in response to hearing me talk about my abuser.
I actually remember that moment well. And the gift of engaging a woman of integrity is that even when new data comes, there's not an immediate dismissal or defensiveness. Oh, that's there for all of us to some degree, but an openness to explore. And that's part of the oddity, a lovely, but nonetheless oddity you are, in that a very closed system theologically, in some ways a very good but nonetheless closed family, and also a heartbreakingly closed circuit of silence and secrecy. I know it's an impossible question. I don't care. How is it possible that your heart remains so open?
I think about just being, I'm going back to that highly sensitive reality of who I am because it's just something that's really been helping me even lately. But I think about how I always knew there was so much more because my body and my heart were so responsive to beauty, to people's stories and faces. And I just think it has kept me open, even though so many times that's actually also made it more painful to be open. But I love to be alive.
Yeah. Well, and it's not the most subtle shift in the world, but I'm just going to say you and your stunningly good husband have chosen to take in a stunningly beautiful little girl. And I'd love for you to talk about everything we've been talking about and the presence of, I think of her because I've heard you say her name, Mouse, often. So Marigold.
Yeah. She is a girl with a lot of names because that's how we roll in my family. But yeah, Mouse, Marigold. I think, even just bringing in that category of orphan into this conversation and my own sense of feeling orphaned. My whole life I've been very intrigued by and tenderized to orphans and got to have many experiences of working for those children who don't have parents, including living in Sri Lanka and working in a children's home there. And that being what even made me want to become a therapist. And then becoming a social worker and working in the foster care system and always wanting to be a foster parent. And so 5 years ago, Gabriel and I got foster licensed, and we were able to bring home a very radiant child. We call her Goldie because she is pure gold. And she has been with us for 4.5 years, and she is 4.5 years old. So it's a huge part of our story that we've been holding for a long time. And we're able to actually adopt her in April, and she is now our forever child.
Well, this certainly isn't my story, but I'm going to give just one sentence. It's been agony. I mean, there have been so many ups and downs in this process for the fullness of adoption to occur. Again, you can't fully describe all that you've been through, but I'd love for you to take us through a few of the significant highs and lows of this process.
Well, I would say becoming foster licensed in the first place is definitely agonizing for someone who prefers to be fairly private, to have every corner, every drawer of my home looked through, every aspect of my story looked through the lens of, are you a safe person? Even to have to name some of these things about the abuse in my past and to have them held that way by a state social worker is not the same as in kindness. So just becoming foster licensed was deeply hard. But then, when I think about the day that we brought her home and the weeks following that, people commented on the radiance of my face in a way that no one ever has. I was just so full of the most embodied joy and delight to have my own little person who I got to take so much care of and be so attached to from the very beginning. Yeah. So, and then just to have years in which I did not feel like the state was doing what they should be doing for what she needed, which was permanency. She just sort of, her case malingered in the system for no good reason. And just to have that feeling of powerlessness over someone's life, that means so much to me. It's unspeakable, to be honest.
Yeah. And just to ask, even as you talk, how are you in your body as you talk? Because I'm asking you to step back into both the highs and the terrible lows of a long, almost unendurable process.
Yeah, I can feel like sort of the tension tensing in my muscles of the fight that I felt for such a long time, of like this fight of wanting to fight for this child and have a voice. And yet that's not how the system really works. So using my voice to the best of my ability, but knowing that really I didn't have a lot of power, just put me in a really uncomfortable physical place for 4 years. Yeah, it's really unendurable. And yet we endured it.
Well, I'm just thinking how you've so generously shared similar experiences of your young heart and body and mind, of that kind of powerlessness. And again, I want to say this carefully, because I am not someone who thinks God gives us hard things to teach us lessons so that later in life we can like do something good. I think God is in the work of redemption and redeeming what has been lost, or what has the heavy burdens. And when I think about your unique journey with mothering, both being mothered, developing into a mother, and I can't think of any person better suited to mother Marigold, and the ways her little body needs attunement and containment and just care in really particular ways that you will feel and know, not just because you're highly sensitive, but because you've done the hard, courageous, sometimes terrifying, but also so restorative work of understanding your own story, and not just in a theoretical kind of, oh, let me talk about the themes of my story, but in those deeply embodied ways where our story, we are in-storied and it lives in our body. And I would imagine there's already been many moments where your kind of in-storied, intuitive, sensitive way of tending to her has hopefully maybe given something back to you as well. I don't know if that's true for you, but
yeah, I think it is certainly true. I have never, I feel my own young tenderness so often when I'm in the midst of parenting, even telling stories at night, or just being more actively a singer of lullabies, as one does when they have a little child, and how soothing that is even to me. But as well, I'm so thankful to have gone through story work, being a foster parent and now adoptive mother, in that every child who comes into the system, who is adopted, whether having been given up for adoption at birth or through foster system, it's trauma. And I'm so thankful that I get to be an adoptive mother who knows that from the beginning, and that doesn't have to be something that I have to be scared of, that I can mother her and know, like, there's trauma. We started as a family in a place of trauma, and that never has to be hidden or secretive.
Well, again, I can't help but say again what Rachel put words to, and that is the government, the system, in so many ways paralleled your family. And in that powerlessness, and the need, in one sense, to be violated. I don't think that's too strong a word. To be violated, yet patient, to wait, to suffer the process of a dream to be fulfilled, even if those dreams were early through another story. And now, with Goldie, to be able to dream not only about yourself as a mother, but her as your daughter. And I having been around her, but not for, it just breaks my heart to say not for a long time since COVID, but she's one sweet, wild child, and one that you go, oh, I want to live long enough to see where this child grows to be. So I already have a sense that she's not only giving you a context to be mothered or to mother, but also to be mothered, because she is a force.
Well, I was just going to say, it is such a there's something so incredibly delightful about mothering a girl who is full of voice. Her voice is so strong. In fact, she rarely stops speaking. And as someone who did not have that experience as a child, to hear everything she thinks and everything she's experiencing, and she, similar to me, reads my face as I read my mother's, but she comments on everything. Mama, why did your face look like that? It's intense, but it's reveals so much of how much kids are actually taking in and seeing. It's amazing.
Again, if I can just go back to Rachel's so terribly important point, and that is, we do not believe God brings suffering so we can somehow mature. But there is suffering, and in it, the potential for restoration, a kind of replay, but original. Again, that makes no sense. This is a replay, but it's so original. It's so lovely and lively. An orphan who's not an orphan takes on an orphan who becomes a mother, that enables that orphan to mother, but be mothered. Damn, that's one fine story. Gwen, thank you. Thank you so much for the privilege of being with you. And the invitation again and again is, will we all continue to read, to be captured by, and to be open to the reality of what the great storyteller wants us to read, but also to write. And you have written one glorious story. Thank you. Rachel, you know it is such a joy an honor to have time to talk about story with you. One of the greatest joys at the Allender Center is to be able to lead and support story engagement through our story workshop.
That's definitely true, Dan. And actually, our next story workshop is coming up October 14th through 17th. At the story workshop, Wendell Moss, Dan, and myself lead you through teaching to help explore your own story and the themes of your life in a supportive environment. We have a wonderful group of facilitators, many of whom you've been hearing from, who are trained to help you engage your story in a small group setting. And there can be incredibly profound healing and transformation in those 3 short days.
Oh, it's incredible. Really. And unfortunately, we often get folks who say, this must be for therapists, this must be for professionals, but actually it's for anyone looking to understand their story more deeply and to understand how it intersects with the story of the gospel. Look, no matter the harm that you've endured, there is always the hope for resurrection, but we've got to have the courage to enter into dark places if we want to know more about the reality of the light. So, look, we're inviting you to a renewed vitality in your own life and the ability to engage the stories of others.
And with all that we have been suffering in these past 18 months, and with the world changing so rapidly, it has never been a more important time for you to gain crucial understanding of your own life and the ways in which your story has shaped how you operate in the world. So you should definitely submit your application to participate in the story workshop today at the allendercenter.org/events.
The Allender Center podcast is produced by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology.
If you'd like more information about the Allender Center, you can look at theallendercenter.org.